I had studied humans for 3 standard cycles, yet nothing in our archives prepared me for the moment their stillness filled the council chamber. That is the first thing I must record. It was not anger that announced the change. It was silence. Before that day, humanity existed in our files as a contradiction, a species born on a death world, scarred by internal wars, yet unfailingly courteous once they reached the stars. They smiled at predators. They bowed to conquerors. They apologized when insulted, when threatened, even when bleeding. Council analysts labeled it a survival adaptation, polite mode, a learned behavior meant to soften the galaxy's claws long enough for them to coexist. I believed at assessment. So did everyone else. The council chamber was in its usual state of ceremonial cruelty when the session began. Light refracted off floating sigils of authority. Elder species perched on gravity thrones, ancient and confident. The humans stood, as always, without augmentation, without visible armor, hands folded calmly behind their backs. The accusations were delivered with clinical precision. Humanity was charged with breaching defensive treaties on the Karos frontier. A coalition task force had been destroyed. A colony world had resisted instead of submitting. The footage was played in full. Cities burning, coalition ships breaking apart under human fire. It was meant to shame them. I watched the human delegate carefully, expecting discomfort, averted eyes, diplomatic concession, perhaps another apology, offered in that soft, infuriating way humans had perfected. Instead, the smile left their face. Not abruptly, not dramatically. It simply faded, as if it had never truly belonged there. The chamber continued speaking for several heartbeats before anyone noticed the change. When they did, conversations faltered. I felt my secondary lungs tighten. Predatory species leaned back in their thrones, instincts whispering warnings their minds could not yet justify. The human delegate lifted their head. No threat was issued, no objection raised. They straightened their posture, an insignificant motion, yet one that drew every sensor in the chamber toward them. Linguistic monitors flickered, emotional dampeners recalibrated. Then the human spoke. Their voice had not grown louder. It had grown denser. Each word landed with the weight of deliberate choice. They corrected the first inaccuracy, dates altered to justify coalition movement. The second, treaty clauses selectively quoted. The third, casualty classifications mislabeled to minimize civilian loss. No emotion, just facts. The council attempted to interrupt. The human raised one finger, not in challenge, but in request. The chamber quieted against its will. Then the human asked a question I will never forget. Sensors spiked across the room. Tone analysis flagged a shift beyond any known human diplomatic pattern. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a disengagement of restraint. I realized, with a chill that rippled through my neural crest, that polite mode was not weakness. It was containment. Permission was granted because the council had never imagined refusal necessary. When the human continued, they did not shout, they did not accuse, they explained. They displayed records, unfiltered transmissions from the Karos colony, requests for negotiation, offers of medical aid, warnings issued repeatedly to coalition commanders, each message time-stamped, each ignored. Then came the casualty lists, names, ages, genetic lineages, children. The chamber had heard of death before. We are an old galaxy, but never had grief been delivered with such surgical control. The humans did not weep. They did not pause. They recited loss the way a weapon system recites targeting data. I felt shame, an emotion my species claims not to experience. Counselors shifted uneasily. Some turned away. Others stared, transfixed, as the realization crept through the chamber. This was not a defense. It was a correction. The human delegate concluded the presentation and looked up once more. Their expression was not furious. It was resolved. "You mistook our restraint for submission," they said. "You mistook our patience for fear." The word politeness echoed strangely, as if stripped of its former meaning. "This session," the human continued, "is not to ask forgiveness." I remember thinking then, absurdly, that we had never seen a human honest before, not fully. Everything prior had been filtered, softened, translated for our comfort. This was humanity without translation. The chamber remained silent long after the human finished speaking. No verdict was issued, no ruling made. Even the eldest counselors hesitated, sensing that something irreversible had occurred. As the session adjourned, the human delegate resumed their polite posture. The smile returned. Apologies were offered for the disturbing nature of the evidence presented. But the mask had slipped, and every species in that chamber knew, with growing dread, that it could slip again. I filed my preliminary report that cycle, with a single note appended at the end, one the council would later claim I overemphasized. We have not angered humanity yet, but we now know what it looks like when they stop pretending not to be. And somewhere beyond the chamber walls, far from the reach of council law, I sensed the galaxy shifting, slowly, inevitably, toward consequences we were no longer prepared to face. Among the coalition, restraint has always meant one thing: inferiority. In our histories, predators advance and prey yield. Borders are not negotiated, they are tested. When a species retreats, abandons territory, or offers concession instead of counterstrike, the conclusion is immediate and unanimous: they cannot hold what they claim. Humanity had been doing this for years. The council replayed the evidence as if it were already settled, recordings of human vessels withdrawing rather than pursuing.
Colonies evacuated instead of fortified. Diplomatic envoys bowing their heads, conceding mineral rights, accepting sanctions that would have provoked wars among older species. I remember several counselors nodding along, satisfied. To them, the pattern was obvious. The humans did not interrupt. When the footage ended, the presiding elder turned toward the human delegation, antennae raised in something approximating pity. The human delegate inclined their head politely. Then they spoke a single word: trigger. It was not delivered with heat. It was delivered the way one might label a diagram. The delegate gestured, and the chamber's projection field shifted. The council expected rebuttal, perhaps philosophical justification, perhaps moral appeal. Instead, we were shown numbers. Not interstellar skirmishes, not border conflicts, but wars, dense, layered, horrifyingly intimate. The human homeworld filled the display, its continents marked not by territory lines, but by casualty gradients. Red deepened to black. Time compression showed conflicts overlapping, one catastrophe bleeding into another. The chamber grew quieter with each passing second. They showed us how many times their civilization had fractured along ideological, biological, and cultural lines. How often extinction had come not from outside threats, but from themselves. They spoke of global wars fought with chemical fire, kinetic saturation, weapons so primitive our historians initially assumed the data was symbolic. It was not. Casualty figures scrolled past, numbers so large several counselors requested verification. The human delegate provided it without comment. I felt something I did not like: unease. The projection shifted. First, endurance matters more than dominance. Second, unity is a choice, not an instinct. They let that settle. Politeness, the delegate said, is not natural to us. It is learned. I watched the predatory species in the chamber shift uncomfortably. This was not the narrative we expected. Humans were supposed to be young, naive, untested. Instead, they were veterans of apocalypse. Then came the turning point. The display collapsed into a single chart, clean, minimal, devastating. A timeline marked by brief, dark interruptions. What you call polite mode, the human said, is our default state. They did not name them at first. They did not need to. Entire civilizations vanished from the records during those intervals. Trade networks simply ended. Pirate coalitions that once controlled sectors dissolved without final battles, their territories reclaimed by silence. Wars concluded not with treaties, but with absence, no survivors to negotiate on behalf of. The temperature in the chamber dropped several degrees as environmental systems compensated for collective stress responses. No pride, no triumph, just explanation. I realized then that the humans were not warning us. Warnings carry emotion: fear, anger, desperation. This carried none. They were clarifying a misunderstanding. Their gaze, soft, almost regretful, settled briefly on the coalition representatives. The species that attacked our colony believed tolerance meant surrender. The projection shifted again, this time to the Kairos incident. No dramatic explosions, no heroic framing, just timelines. Systems disabled in sequence, communications severed,
Leadership neutralized. Civilian evacuation corridors opened and monitored until complete. The coalition fleet ceased to exist not in a blaze, but in silence. We corrected their error, the humans said, decisively, surgically. The council chamber was utterly still. I found myself reviewing the data not as an analyst, but as something closer to prey, mapping distances, outcomes, probabilities of survival if such attention were ever turned toward my species. Then the realization struck me with frightening clarity. Humanity does not escalate emotionally. They do not lose control. They do not rage. They escalate strategically. Every retreat we had cataloged, every apology we had mocked, every concession we had exploited, it had all been weighed against outcomes we never imagined they were calculating. The human delegate concluded their presentation and folded their hands once more behind their back. The smile did not return this time, but neither did hostility. "We are not offended by your assumptions," they said gently. "We understand them." That, more than anything else, chilled me, because it meant they had already walked this path before, mistaking restraint for weakness and paying for it in blood. The presiding elder attempted to speak, failed, tried again. The words that finally emerged were procedural, hollow. The session was suspended pending further review. As the chamber lights dimmed, I remained frozen, staring at the final chart still burned into my vision. A simple truth had been revealed, and it terrified me more than any threat ever could. The galaxy had mistaken humanity's self-control for incapacity, and now that mistake had been corrected. I left the chamber knowing something irreversible had begun, not a war but a recalibration of fear, and deep within my instincts, a single thought repeated itself, growing louder with every step. If this was humanity explaining themselves, what would it look like when they decided explanation was no longer necessary? The council demanded justification, not explanation, justification, as if the annihilation of a coalition fleet were a clerical error that could be corrected with sufficient argument, as if the destruction itself were the crime, rather than the sequence of choices that had made it unavoidable. The demand was issued formally, stamped with authority seals older than human civilization. I remember thinking with detached horror that the council still believed itself in control of the narrative. The humans responded by turning on a clock. It appeared in the center of the chamber, simple, linear, merciless.
A timeline measured not in rhetoric, but in timestamps. The clock began to scroll backward. Every provocation appeared as a marker. Coalition patrols entering restricted zones, trade convoys seized for inspection and never returned, diplomatic messages transmitted, acknowledged, then ignored, distress calls from frontier civilians flagged as non-essential. The human delegate did not raise their voice. They did not accuse. They narrated. "Patience," they said, "is not a virtue to us." The chamber stirred uneasily. "Like any resource," the delegate continued, "it can be measured, allocated." The timeline slowed as it approached the Karos colony incident. Each marker expanded into recorded evidence, audio logs, sensor data, unedited transmissions. I listened to a human colony administrator issue evacuation warnings to approaching coalition vessels. The tone was calm, almost apologetic. Coordinates for safe withdrawal corridors were provided. Medical assistance was offered in advance should coalition crews require it. Even as orbital defense grids came online, the humans asked their attackers to leave. The final transmission played in full. "This is a civilian system," the human voice said. "We do not want this." There was no response. The clock advanced one final increment. What followed on the display was not chaos. It was order. Human vessels emerged from concealment in precise formation. Engines were not targeted for destruction, but paralysis. Coalition ships drifted, helpless, their drives locked in failure states that could not be overridden. Communications arrays went dark next, not jammed, but severed cleanly, isolating each ship from the others. Panic rippled through the enemy fleet too late to coordinate a response. Weapon systems were neutralized last. I remember realizing with a sinking feeling that the humans had designed the sequence deliberately, not to win faster, but to control the psychological collapse of their opponents. Boarding actions followed. The recordings were restrained. Human soldiers moved through enemy corridors with disciplined speed. Non-combatants were extracted first. Wounded coalition crew were stabilized by human medics before their own officers were even located. Command decks were sealed only after evacuation was confirmed. Then they were erased. Not exploded, not breached, just ended.
The coalition fleet ceased functioning as an organized force before most of its crews understood that a war had begun. They paused. The council chamber was silent. Even species evolved for constant conflict seemed diminished by the efficiency of it. There had been no room for heroism, no glorious last stand, no narrative of noble resistance, just inevitability. Then the casualty figures appeared. I heard several counselors inhale sharply. The numbers did not align with expectation. A fleet of that size, neutralized so completely, should have produced catastrophic loss of life. It had not.
Enemy casualties were low, shockingly low, lower than some of the Council's so-called peacekeeping actions. The human delegate did not emphasize this. They did not need to. We did not celebrate, they said quietly. The display shifted again, this time not to tactical data, but to images from the colony afterward. Human civilians gathering wreckage, memorial markers placed for the dead, human and coalition alike, names carved carefully, even when no bodies were recovered. The humans had grieved for their attackers. I watched elder species avert their eyes. Something cold coiled in my core. Rage I could understand. Hatred, even cruelty would have fit our expectations. This discipline after restraint was gone, unnerved me deeply. The humans had chosen mercy after polite mode disengaged. That frightened me more than any display of savagery could have. If this was humanity angry, what did humanity desperate look like? The delegate allowed the images to fade before speaking again. "We will always choose peace first," they said. Several counselors relaxed, mistaking the words for reassurance. The sentence did not echo because it was loud. It echoed because it was final. No one challenged them. No one could. In that moment, I felt the balance shift, not militarily, but ethically. The council had long justified its authority by claiming moral oversight, the right to define acceptable violence. Humanity had just demonstrated something far more dangerous. They had shown restraint without oversight, discipline without enforcement, and power without indulgence. For the first time in recorded council history, we feared losing something more precious than territory or influence. We feared losing moral authority. The session ended without resolution. Deliberations were postponed. Committees were formed that no one believed would matter. As the chamber emptied, I remained seated, staring at the space where the human delegate had stood. The clock was gone, the data erased, but its meaning lingered. Patience, I now understood, was not infinite, and humanity had been counting. Somewhere beyond the reach of council chambers and polished rhetoric, new calculations were already being made, and I could not escape the thought that if we ever forced humanity to count down again, the galaxy might not survive the next zero. The council ordered an independent investigation within a single rotation. It was meant to reassert authority, to remind humanity and itself that no species stood beyond review. Oversight committees were assembled, neutral observers selected, legal frameworks dusted off from centuries of disuse. The humans welcomed it. That should have been our first warning. They did not protest jurisdiction. They did not negotiate terms. I expected curated access, sanitized records, the diplomatic equivalent of locked doors and polite deflection. Instead, they gave us everything.
The first archive chamber destabilized 3 translation matrices before we realized what we were seeing. Data volumes spanned millennia. Not galactic history, human history. Wars cataloged not by victory, but by failure, collapse, near extinction. And beneath them all, a category none of us had anticipated: contingencies. They were marked clearly, indexed, cross-referenced. Some dated back before humanity had unified its home world. Others had been updated mere cycles before first contact with the Council. One investigator asked why these files existed at all. The human archivist answered without hesitation. The simulations were disturbing. Entire star systems modeled into silence, supply chains unraveled with mathematical inevitability, cultural collapse projected not through bombardment, but through removal, leadership excised, military structures dismantled, ideological cores deprived of oxygen. No conquest flags, no annexation markers, just absence. "These are labeled never to be used," one counselor observed, struggling to keep their voice steady. "Yes," the human replied. They called them contingencies, not plans, measures to be enacted only if every other option failed. They were not aspirational, they were preventative, vaccinations against extinction. The investigators demanded clarification. The answer came without pause. Not punishment, not deterrence, finality. I felt my secondary hearts tighten painfully at the word.
The humans elaborated patiently, as if explaining a fundamental misunderstanding to children. Conquest, they told us, creates resistance. Occupation breeds resentment. Punishment invites revenge. Defense, true defense, removes the capacity for harm entirely. When we are forced to fight defensively, the delegate said, we do not seek to win the next battle. Polite mode, they explained, was not merely diplomacy. It was containment. A psychological barrier, carefully constructed, rigorously maintained, between what humans can do and what they allow themselves to do. They had learned, through bitter experience, that unchecked escalation destroyed not only enemies, but the self. The room leaned forward as one. The investigation continued for cycles. Every accusation examined, every data point verified. Council analysts searched desperately for violations, 3D breaches, disproportional response, concealed atrocities. They found none, only preparation. Preparation so exhaustive it bordered on obsession. Humanity had planned for betrayal before joining the Council. They had modeled scenarios where allies turned hostile, where oversight failed, where diplomacy collapsed entirely. They had accounted for being outnumbered, outgunned, and morally condemned. They had hoped never to use any of it. The final report was devastating in its simplicity. No violations found. The coalition species responsible for the Karas raid was gone. Not conquered, not occupied. Gone.
Their military infrastructure dismantled with surgical precision, command hierarchies dissolved, war production facilities decommissioned or repurposed under human supervision, civilian populations relocated, safely, humanely, to neutral systems with aid packages that dwarfed the Council's own relief efforts. No banners raised, no territory claimed. The species simply ceased to be a threat. I remember the silence that followed the report's reading. It was not disbelief, it was comprehension settling into terror. This was what humans meant by defensive war. Not victory, resolution. In the cycles that followed, the galaxy began to whisper. Trade hubs echoed with a new phrase, spoken quietly, reverently, like a superstition one did not dare test. I returned to my quarters and began drafting my report. My appendages trembled despite conscious control. Every sentence felt inadequate, every warning insufficient. Humanity was not dangerous because they were violent. Violence was common, predictable, manageable. Humanity was dangerous because they were right. Right about patience, right about restraint, right about the cost of survival in a hostile universe. They had endured long enough to learn when mercy saved lives and when it merely delayed extinction. As I finalized the report, a notification flickered at the edge of my vision. A minor incident, a border dispute, another species probing human response times. Routine, some would have said. I paused, staring at the alert longer than necessary. Somewhere, I knew, contingency models were updating, calculations adjusting, barriers holding, for now. And the thought that followed chilled me deeper than any projection I had seen in the archives. Humanity had shown us what defensive war looked like. They had not yet shown us what came after. I submitted the report and powered down my console, unable to escape the sense that the galaxy stood on the edge of a lesson far harsher than the last. Because now we knew the rules, and knowing them did not make us safer. It only meant we would recognize the sound when polite mode broke for good. It began as a question almost no one dared to ask. A counselor from the erythral sector, claws twitching nervously, leaned forward. The chamber fell silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Polite questioning is one thing. This was something different, a probe into a behavior none of our species could reconcile with power. The human delegate paused. Not a short pause, not the perfunctory hesitation diplomats employ while calculating tone. This was long, deliberate, considered, long enough for the weight of the chamber to press on every observer. Then they spoke, quietly, almost apologetically. At first, I thought this was metaphor, a turn of phrase, but it was literal. Their explanation unfolded with the calm inevitability of measured steps. Humans apologize not from weakness, not from shame, not to mollify others. They apologize from awareness.
Awareness that once escalation begins, it cannot be reversed. Awareness that actions have consequences, that lives will be altered, destroyed, or ended. That restraint, once released, never fully returns. The chamber shifted uneasily as the humans produced their evidence. Recordings played. Soldiers crouched beside fallen enemies, whispering comfort. Medics moved through battlefield smoke to treat attackers first, assessing pulse and injury before friend or foe. Commanders delayed strikes to allow evacuation corridors to clear. Then, when the moment was optimal, strikes were executed, swift, decisive, irreversible. It was horrifying, and yet it was controlled. Politeness was not a mask. It was not a tactic. It was the final act of kindness a human could extend, to themselves, to their opponents, and to the universe they inhabited. When they said sorry, it was never negotiation. It was closure, a recognition that history, once set in motion, could not be undone. Even the most hardened, war-born species in the chamber shivered. Some turned their faces. Some sat rigid, claws tightening around arms of their chairs. Humans carried guilt, not only for what they had done, but for what they were fully capable of doing. Then the human delegate leaned slightly forward, eyes calm, voice soft but absolute. "If we ever stop apologizing," they said, "leave." A silence heavier than any protocol fell over the room. Some species laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. I logged that statement, trembling, as a level Omega advisory, not because of immediate threat, but because it revealed a truth the galaxy had ignored for centuries. Human conscience is not passive. It is deliberate. It is unyielding. For the first time, I considered that humanity's greatest strength was not speed, not firepower, not numbers. It was conscience. A species capable of choosing morality, even in moments of absolute power, was more terrifying than any predator armed with claws or lasers. I sat back, recording my observations, and wondered aloud, though none could hear me, the thought that had begun to echo in my mind. If this is what humanity does while restrained, politely apologizing, quietly regretting, deliberately weighing the cost, what will they do if polite mode ever fails? The chamber waited, and I realized, as did every species present, that the answer might already be too late to stop. The council convened in a tense atmosphere, chambers humming with formal authority and whispered speculation. Emergency measures had been drafted, oversight committees assembled, safeguards outlined in precise bureaucratic language. Every word was designed to restrict human military autonomy without overt insult, a task the council believed delicate, necessary, and achievable. The humans did not object. That was the first warning none of us recognized. Resistance is predictable. Compliance, unhesitating compliance, is far more unsettling.
They signed every restriction, every clause, every line of the legalese we had meticulously crafted. They offered amendments, clarifications, faster response times, rules of engagement made unambiguous, shared defensive obligations across the sector, all framed as cooperation. Polite, collaborative, helpful. I observed several elder counselors relax, convinced that control had been regained. Some even nodded, whispering praise for the humans' civilized response. And then I noticed the footnote buried deep within the final document. One sentence written with surgical precision that only a human lawyer could engineer. Restrictions apply only while polite mode remains active. Several counselors blinked at one another. A few muttered questions, tentative, unformed. None comprehended the implication. None realized that compliance was conditional, not universal. Then, mid-session, a border flare occurred. A distant sector, unaffiliated with the council, initiated a limited incursion, testing humanity's reaction time. Sensors pinged, alerts flashed, an automatic priority escalation triggered, civilian zones flagged as endangered. The human delegate received the notifications and did nothing. No pause, no acknowledgement, no hasty council query, just silence. Polite mode was active, nothing was threatened yet. The council, believing the vote was decisive, moved forward, passed it unanimously, signed it into effect. The alert repeated, more urgent, lives now directly in the path of threat, yet the delegate remained composed, still seated, hands folded behind their back. A slight incline of the head, a gesture of attention, was all that occurred. Then the delegate rose, apologized to the chamber for any alarm caused by the delay. Their tone was soft, formal, almost courteous, and then without waiting for instruction or debate, they left. By the time the chamber adjourned, the border threat had vanished. No announcements, no triumphal messages, no warnings, only confirmation.
The intrusion had been neutralized before any counselor fully understood it. The vote, intended to constrain, to control, was meaningless, irrelevant before the ink had dried. I recorded the events meticulously, knowing I had witnessed a pivot point in galactic history. Not because humanity had acted aggressively, not because they had flaunted power. Because we, the Council, had tried to control what we did not understand. Humanity endured the attempt. And in the quiet aftermath, they had proven why it would never work. The chamber emptied. Counselors muttered in disbelief, some scuttling to recompute contingencies, others frozen with unease. I sat back, noting that the lesson was subtle but profound. Authority and law are meaningless against a species that voluntarily chooses discipline, restraint, and timing as weapons. Polite mode remained on, but the implications, like the faint shadow of a predator's paw, lingered over the entire council.
History, I realized, would remember this moment. Not for war, not for conquest, but for arrogance, and for the species that quietly refused to be mastered. The galaxy had learned, in the most efficient way possible, that you cannot legislate against intent. You cannot vote against vigilance. And the humans had only just begun to demonstrate what vigilance truly meant. The aftermath was deceptively calm. Humanity returned to polite mode. Trade routes reopened. Cultural exchanges resumed. Diplomats bowed. Scientists shared data. Children laughed in schools as though nothing had ever happened. Apologies were offered for minor delays. Smiles, warm and genuine, flickered across faces that had seen centuries of fire. On the surface, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I had thought the display of calculated force would mark a turning point only in policy or strategy. I was wrong. It marked a turning point in perception. The galaxy had glimpsed what it meant to contain humanity's restraint, and to comprehend, briefly, what lay beyond it. We now knew the cost of that politeness, the discipline required to maintain it, the monsters it restrained. Humans were not pretending to be kind. They were choosing kindness, every day, repeatedly, consciously. Some species withdrew quietly to reassess their positions. They recalculated alliances, built buffer zones, reconsidered diplomatic overtures. Others tried to provoke humanity again, testing the limits of patience with minor incursions or verbal challenges. Those species no longer exist in any form. I observed humans in ordinary settings, civilians laughing as a painter completed a mural, engineers building starships in celebration of cooperation rather than war, families mourning the dead quietly, respectfully, without spectacle. Survivors of the Karos raid rebuilt their colony under human guidance, with assistance from former rivals. Humanity extended invitations to the galaxy to help, and many came, humbled. They always do that. Humanity does not govern by fear. They do not dominate through terror or weaponized legend. They govern by example, and by the indelible knowledge of what occurs when that example is ignored. The galaxy remembers the consequences, even when humans smile again. I found myself shifting through a spectrum of emotion. Admiration, first, for their ingenuity and restraint. Respect, for the moral clarity that even veterans of interstellar war lacked. Fear, not of them, but of losing them as allies, of miscalculating, of misunderstanding their intentions again. Perhaps that was their truest power. Not weapons, not fleets, not clever diplomacy. The power to make the galaxy understand that choice itself is a form of force. Choice, discipline, conscience. And beneath every smile, every apology, every polite correction, humanity reminded us the monsters they restrained were always real. The only reason the galaxy survived was because they chose to hold the line. And we had finally seen what survives when politeness is gone. I filed my final observation with trembling appendages. Humanity's greatest weapon is not its fury. It is its restraint. And for the first time, I understood that restraint could terrify far more than rage. The chamber may have emptied, the borders may have quieted, and the treaties may have been signed. But the knowledge, the understanding of what humans could do, lingered. And the galaxy, willingly or not, would never forget it. I conclude this record not as an account of triumph, nor as an analysis of military prowess. I conclude it as a warning, and as a lesson.
Humanity is not special because they are stronger than other species, not because they are faster, smarter, or possess technologies beyond comprehension. Humanity is special because they endure, they restrain, they choose mercy in a universe that rewards cruelty, celebrates opportunism, and punishes hesitation. And yet, even mercy has limits. The species that survived the awakening of human patience were not the strongest. They were not the fastest. They were the wisest. They listened when humanity spoke. They observed when humanity acted. They adapted their own ambitions to the boundaries humanity quietly set. They respected the limits imposed not by law, not by treaties, but by the will of a species capable of measured response. The others, those who ignored caution, who tested restraint, who misread kindness for weakness, became footnotes in human records, obliterated, absorbed, or erased. Their names endure only in the cautionary tales whispered across the galaxy, reminders of arrogance, miscalculation, and impatience. Yet, humanity continues, still polite, still apologetic, still offering aid first, still extending hands to those who have yet to understand. And every species that now thrives beside them has internalized a fundamental truth we once ignored. Polite mode is a gift. It is not a guarantee. Every smile carries the weight of choice. Every apology carries the memory of destruction restrained. Every act of mercy is measured against what might have been unleashed if polite mode were lifted. And the moment it is lifted, history stops being forgiving. I file this report not in condemnation, but in gratitude. Not because humanity demanded it, but because they earned it through centuries of deliberate restraint. The galaxy survived. It endured. It rebuilt. Because humanity chose to let it. They did not conquer through fear. They did not dominate through spectacle. They survived through restraint. They ruled through example. And we, observers, analysts, diplomats, historians, are left with the stark, uncomfortable knowledge that the greatest force in the universe is not firepower, not numbers, not strategy. It is choice. The choice to hold back when all else compels you to strike. I close this record knowing one immutable fact. Humanity is not just alive.
Humanity is the standard against which all others will now be measured. And for that, the galaxy owes them everything. Polite, merciful, relentless in restraint. Humanity endured. Humanity endured. And the universe survives because of it.